Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at Meinongs Jungle. This is going to be a video on the theory of objects, specifically Meinong's theory of objects, and it's going to be a little bit more advanced than some of the videos we generally do here. If you find yourself getting confused or you're not understanding all the concepts here, go ahead and try watching some of the videos from the 100 Days of Logic series, especially the last 10 days that we're coming up on pretty soon here. And then come back to this video and see if it makes a little bit more sense. A quick caveat before we get going. This is a basic introduction to Meinong's Jungle and Meinong's Theory of Objects. If you want more information, check out Meinong's Theory of Objects by John Nienmeyer Findlay or Alexius Meinong on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. With that out of the way, let's get started. Now, in order to understand any theory of objects, particularly Meinong's, we need to understand what we mean by ontology. Someone's ontology is what they believe exists, or how they separate things into things that exist and things that don't exist. Generally, most philosophers are going to say that tables, mountains, people exist, while unicorns, round squares, and the King of France do not exist. There are going to be some borderline cases that people disagree on, such as numbers, minds, knowledge, and God. Whether or not those things exist may be up to debate. Meinong, however, is going to take a little bit of a different view when it comes to ontology. He's going to take both things that exist and things that don't exist into his ontology. He's going to conclude that even things like round squares exist in some sense. Basically, Meinong is going to say P or not P, I'll have both. It's not an actual quote. Now, an object. We need to understand Meinong's theory of objects in order to understand his ontology. So, how does Meinong define an object? An object is something that can be the target of a mental act. What does that mean? That just means that objects are things that you can think about. Interesting. The problem here is this means that there are objects of which it is true that there are no such objects. Because you can think about things that don't exist. But just because you're able to think about it, that means that it is an object. In order to defend this seemingly contradictory principle, Meinong is going to give us two more principles. The principle of independence of so being from being, and the principle of indifference of pure object to being. I told you it was going to get complicated. Following up, we're going to take a look at Meinong's support for these two principles. So, the principle of independence of so being from being is an object's ability to have properties is independent from that object's being or non-being. Basically what that means is even if unicorns don't exist, they can still have horns, or it can still be the case that they have horns. He's going to support this with two principles. The characterization principle. Any object has those properties that it is characterized as having. The xy is x and y. And a denial of the ontological assumption. The ontological assumption is there are not true propositions about objects that do not have being. Meinong is going to deny that. Basically, he's going to say that we can make true statements about things that have non-being, or don't have being. The other principle he's going to use to back his position up is the principle of indifference of pure object to being. That's going to be, pure objects are by nature indifferent to whether they have being or non-being. Basically what this is saying is, a unicorn's properties would not change if it started or stopped existing. A unicorn wouldn't suddenly stop having a horn if it started existing. Or it wouldn't change in some way if it went from non-being to being. In order to maintain this position, Meinong is going to accept the law of non-contradiction in a very specific formulation. He's going to accept it under the form that allows for non-contradiction of sentence negation, but not ontological negation. We'll take a look at that in a sec. But first we need to understand what Meinong means by incomplete objects. More vocabulary. Like I said, it's pretty complicated. These are objects that are determined in respect to some properties, but not others. An example would be a triangle, or the triangle. Triangles have the property of having three sides, but do not possess the property of either being scalene or not being scalene. In this case, we're not talking about a specific triangle. We are talking about triangle in general. That incomplete object triangle that does not yet possess the property of being scalene or not being scalene. The important point here is that triangle can have neither the property of being scalene or not being scalene. So it's important to note that saying it is not the case that this triangle is scalene does not imply that it is the case that this triangle is not scalene. Wow, did I just blow your mind? What we're saying is, just because we've denied the statement, this triangle is scalene, does not mean that the triangle has the property of not being scalene. It might be the case that that triangle just has neither the property of being scalene or not being scalene. We're also going to support this, have to re-examine our law of the excluded middle. We'll take a look at that in a second. But first, we need a few more vocabulary words. We have constitutive. These are properties that determine objects. Constitutive properties are properties that determine objects. Having three angles is a constitutive property of a triangle. We also have consecutive properties. Consecutive properties are properties that follow from constitutive properties. Having three sides is a consecutive property of a triangle, because a triangle is only defined as having three angles. Triangle, three angles. But if it has three angles, it must have three sides. That, therefore, is a consecutive property. We'll revisit those terms in a bit, but they're important to note along with these ideas of incomplete and complete objects. Now, back to our conceptions of the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. So, Meinong is going to accept this following law. For all properties F and all objects X, it is not the case that both X is F and it is not the case that X is F. However, he is also going to make the following assertion. There exists some property F and there exists some object X such that X is F and X is not F. Those may seem to be in contradiction, but according to Meinong, they're not. The reason is one of them is talking about the negation of a sentence or a statement, while the other is talking about the negation of a property. Let's take a look. So, we notice that in the first statement, I have negation symbolized by that kind of sideways L, that sentence negation. While in the second statement, I have negation symbolized by the little squiggly line, the tilde. That is property negation. The point here is that X is not F is not the same as it is not the case that X is F. Basically, a square is not round is not the same as it is not the case that a square is round. What does this mean? Well, let's take a look and try to unpack it a little more. So, a round square can be both round and not round. In fact, it has to be both round and not round to be a round square. But to say that it is the case that the square is round and it is not the case that the square is round is a contradiction. By denying the full statement, we run into a contradiction, but by merely denying the property, we do not, under Meinong's understanding. You're allowed to have contradictory properties, but propositions that contradict are not allowed. As I mentioned earlier, Meinong is also going to have to re-examine the law of the excluded middle. The version of the law of the excluded middle that Meinong will accept goes as follows. For all properties F and all objects X, either it is the case that X is F or it is not the case that X is F. However, he's also going to assert the following claim. There exists some property F, and there exists some object X, such that it is not the case that X is F, or X is not F. This is similar to what we were saying with those incomplete objects. We can have objects that exist and have neither the property of being F or not being F. What we can't have is both the statement X is F and the statement it is not the case that X is F. Once again, we have X is not F is not the same as it is not the case that X is F. It's the same distinction we had with the law of non-contradiction, but it's reimagined a little bit here. The triangle is not scalene is not the same as it is not the case that the triangle is scalene. This is the distinction we mentioned earlier. We're going to dig into it a little bit deeper, just in case it didn't settle in the first time. You can have an ideal triangle and a specific triangle. The ideal triangle is neither scalene nor non-scalene. It fulfills that it is not the case that X is F or X is not F. The specific triangle is in fact not scalene. By the look of it, it's equilateral. It fulfills the quality or has the property of not being F or not being scalene. For the ideal triangle, it is not the case that this triangle is scalene. We deny the statement, but we don't deny or affirm the property. For the specific triangle as well, it is not the case that this triangle is scalene, but it's important to note that the denial of the statement is not equivalent to the denial of the property. While some things, when we deny the statement, are going to deny the property as well. Not all things, when we deny the statement, will deny the property as well, as with the example of the ideal triangle. Couple more conceptions we have to get, or vocabulary we have to understand before we move on. One of them, nuclear properties. Nuclear properties are properties which characterize the nature of the presented object. These are properties that are constitutive or consecutive. Look back in the video if you forgot those definitions. For a round square, these would be properties like being round or being square. Then there are also extranuclear properties. These are properties that are not constitutive or consecutive, being determined by the nuclear property of being round, being determined by the nuclear property of being square. You could have the property of being round, but not be determined by that or have that as your nuclear property. Being undetermined by the property of blue, being contradictorily determined, or having non-being. These are extranuclear properties. These are properties that are not constitutive or consecutive of being a round square. Finally, one last note. When we look at the characterization principle, any object has those properties that it is characterized as having. The xy is x and y. There are two readings we can take of this statement. Either one in which it is analytically true and does not make an existential claim, or one in which it is synthetically true and it does make an existential claim. Under the analytically true version, it expresses pure objects, those objects that have non-being, without any existential commitment. Under the synthetically true reading, it expresses actual objects with an existential commitment. For example, if we're talking about the eclipsed sun is eclipsed, we're talking about pure objects, objects that do not have the property of being. The eclipsed sun is eclipsed, it's going to be analytically true. However, when we're talking about the eclipsed sun is eclipsed in terms of a synthetically true statement that does make the existential claim, we're talking about actual objects out there in the world that possess the property of being. The pure object of the sun is eclipsed is going to be an analytically true statement, while the actual sun is eclipsed is going to be a synthetically true statement because you need to go outside in order to determine if it's true. Meinong is going to mean, when he uses the characterization principle, the analytically true version. He is not going to mean the synthetically true. If you see someone claiming that he's using the synthetically true version, they are incorrect as to what Meinong means, and it causes problems for his theory. When we're talking about this kind of statement, we're talking about analyticity, not synthetic. with all of that understood, we can now finally take a look at the taxonomy and the categorization of objects under Meinong's view. So, all things that can be the targets of mental acts are objects, and those objects exist and have outside being. However, those objects can be divided into two categories. Those are objects that have being, existing in the traditional sense, and objects that do not have being, not existing in the traditional sense, or being undetermined with respect to being. Note that they all have this concept of outside being, but not all of them have being as one of their properties. We'll take a look at the objects that have being first. So, objects that have being in the traditional sense are going to be split up into two different categories, real objects and ideal objects. Real objects are objects that both exist and subsist, while ideal objects are objects that subsist but do not exist. This is an interesting distinction between subsisting and existing that we're not really going to get into here because it's not going to have that much pertinence on where we're going. We'll see if we can look at the examples and make sense of it, though. So real objects are objects that exist and subsist. This is going to be our first bucket that objects can fall into. They are complete objects. They're determined with respect to all of their properties. They are things like cakes, tables, dogs, cats, hills, and stars. They exist in some tangible, real sense, and they subsist. Ideal objects are objects that subsist but don't exist. That's bucket number 2. What does that really mean? Well, they're complete objects as well. They're determined with respect to all their properties. But they're things like the state of affairs of the cake being on the table, or the state of affairs of the cake not being in the fridge. You can't really grab or hold the state of affairs of the cake being on the table, but it seems to be something. That relationship or that state of affairs is an ideal object. Or that state of affairs of not having cake in the fridge is an ideal object. The one that makes the most sense to me is the number of cakes in front of me, or numbers. These are ideal objects because it's just a state of affairs, a state of number of cakes on the table in front of me. So, now let's take a look at the other path. Objects that do not have being. These are either objects that don't exist in the traditional sense or are undetermined with respect to being. A warning. We are now entering what is known as Meinongs Jungle. The reason it's called Meinongs Jungle is there's a question put to the proponent of Meinong. The question is, well, you claim that all of these objects that don't exist exist. Well, where don't they exist? Or where are they such that they don't exist in the actual world, but they still exist? The answer, of course, is they exist in Meinongs Jungle, a crazy place full of impossible things. Let's take a look. So, we're dividing this into objects that have non-being, that's not having the property of being, and objects that are not determined with respect to being. If you're confused, take a look at the Meinongian law of the excluded middle to understand the important distinction here. It's important to note that objects that are not determined with respect to being are not undetermined in the sense that we don't know if they exist or not. They are not determined in the sense that they are neither possessing of the property of being, nor are they possessing of the property of non-being. First, we're going to take a look, however, at objects with non-being. These can be divided into two different categories. Non-contradictory objects. These are objects whose properties do not imply a contradiction or who do not have the property of being contradictory. And contradictory objects. Objects whose properties do imply a contradiction or who have the property of being contradictory. We'll take a look at non-contradictory objects first. Non-contradictory objects can be divided into two categories. Complete objects and incomplete objects. These are distinctions that we should understand from earlier. Complete objects are objects that are determined with respect to all their properties, whereas incomplete objects, in this sense, are objects whose non-being is explicitly presupposed. We'll take a look at each of these individually. So, we're talking about, for bucket number 3, complete non-contradictory non-being objects. These are possible but not actualized, fully determined states of affairs. These are things like the cake on the table being made of red velvet instead of funfetti. If in fact the cake on the table is made of funfetti, the cake being made of red velvet is a complete non-contradictory, non-being object. And the Platonist idea of cakehood, if it is in fact the case that Platonism is not the case, because then the Platonist idea of cakehood would not exist as a real object, so it would exist as some kind of possible object. In the Meinongian sense, a complete non-contradictory, non-being object. Now, incomplete non-contradictory, non-being objects are not just incomplete objects. They have a lot of other things going on, and most specifically, they are objects whose non-being is explicitly presupposed, but they're not necessarily contradictory. A perpetual motion machine would be an example. The non-being of this is explicitly presupposed, but it's not contradictory. However, it's incomplete in that we don't know all of the properties that a perpetual motion machine would have. Similarly, a mountain made of cake, its non-being is explicitly presupposed, even though we don't know all the properties of that mountain made of cake. We don't know if it's vanilla, we don't know if it's chocolate. It's not contradictory, but its non-being is going to be presupposed, and therefore it's going to be an incomplete, non-contradictory, non-being object. Bucket number 4. Now, contradictory objects. This is going to be number 5. These are objects whose properties imply contradiction or who possess the property of having contradictory properties. Things like a round square, a cylindrical cake with no rounded sides, or the greatest prime number are all examples of contradictory objects. They have constitutive properties that are in some way in conflict. A round square both is and is not round. Remember, this isn't a problem because we've changed up the law of non-contradiction. So these contradictory objects exist in some sense, in our big overarching outside existence sense. They have non-being, of course, but they exist in the larger sense. That probably was really confusing, so I apologize. Finally, we have objects that are not determined with respect to being. Bucket number 6. These are those objects that are incomplete, not contradictory, and do not have explicitly presupposed non-being. These are things like the triangle. This is like the triangle we were referencing earlier that is neither scalene nor not scalene, or an object with only the property of being blue. These aren't contradictory. It's not presupposed that a triangle or an object with only the property of being blue doesn't exist in the same way that a mountain of cake or a perpetual motion machine might be explicitly presupposed to have non-being. But they are incomplete objects in that they are not determined in terms of the properties of, for example, being scalene or not being scalene, or in the case of blue, having a shape or not having a shape. To recap, the entire schema, the entire taxonomy of objects in terms of Meinong is going to be objects that have being and don't have being. Remember, all objects exist, but within those objects, some have being and some don't have being. Those that have being can either be real or ideal. Real objects are complete, they exist, and they subsist, like cake. Ideal objects are complete and they subsist, like the number of cakes. In objects that do not have being, they can either have non-being or be indeterminate with respect to being. Those objects that have non-being can either be non-contradictory or contradictory. Those non-contradictory, non-being objects can either be complete or incomplete. Complete, non-contradictory, non-being objects that do not have being are things like cake that does not exist but could. Incomplete, non-contradictory, non-being objects that do not have being are things like mountains of cake. That's where the non-being is presupposed. Contradictory, non-being objects that do not have being are things like cylindrical cakes with no rounded sides or round squares. And finally, indeterminate objects with respect to being, or objects that are indeterminate with respect to being and do not have being, are things like an object whose only property is being red velvet. If you understood all of that, that's amazing. It took me a lot of time to get my head around all of those. Watch the video a couple times. If that doesn't make sense, check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article. They probably do a better job of explaining it than I do. Finally, I will leave you with a quote. To remember, if you're overwhelmed by Meinong's Jungle, cut Meinong's Jungle with Occam's razor. Next up, take a look at my videos on the Meinongian ontological argument for the existence of God if you want kind of a way or a place to use this argument and to use this kind of frame of mind. If you're curious, watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.